Hello again. So we will get into the respiratory system. Keep breathing. That's what I'm doing right now when Skype is failing us. So just keep breathing. Study guide. You can pause here if you wanted to take a peek. Alright, so the first part of the respiratory system starts off with kind of the concepts that bind us all together. And so all kind of organisms are open systems that need to exchange material with surrounding environment. And this gives some examples of different ways that creatures exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with their environment. For example, a leech or an earthworm is another example of a creature that exchanges directly through its skin. Sea slugs are an example of an organism that uses gills to get water and to get oxygen from water. Fish is another example, or invertebrates like lobster or shrimp also use gills. Bugs use these kind of branching tube-like structures that go along the sides of their bodies, and then more complex animals, including humans, use lungs. So the kind of overall concept is that a respiratory surface, it really just needs to be thin and moist. So those are that's a requirement for a respiratory system in order for gases to exchange easily across it. So every organism has a blank system, so you might remember this from our first Skype session. So they all need an open system because they all exchange materials with their environment. So complex animals like us have lungs. So another way to describe that is extensively folded or branched internal surface. And so some people think of our lungs as being kind of like big open balloons that air comes in and out of, but really it's like a tree in there. It's all kinds of tubes that get smaller and smaller as they reach the outer aspect of our lungs. So it's all just a series of tubes. It's nothing like a balloon. And that's a good example of what our airways look like inside our lungs. Very tree-like. So the main purpose of our respiratory system allows oxygen to get into our body and get to all of our cells, because our cells, like we kind of touched on in the digestive review, require oxygen in order to create energy to work. And the other thing that a cell does is it gives off carbon dioxide as a waste product, so our body also has to be able to get rid of that. And so that can happen on land, or for some animals it happens in the water. And here's a little review question. All animals require two things for respiration to occur: a surface that is, and I just said, needs to be thin and moist. This is just a chart showing how a cell requires fuel from something like glucose. Then it uses oxygen to do its work to make energy. That's the result it's looking for, and then it gives off this carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So there are phases of gas exchange. So breathing, the actual inhaling and exhaling of air. Then there's the cellular level. So oxygen and carbon dioxide actually need to pass from our respiratory structures into our bloodstream, and so it needs to cross over that surface. And then the oxygen and carbon dioxide actually has to get in and out of the cells that need it. This is a good example, or this is a kind of a diagram showing how oxygen and carbon dioxide traveling through our bloodstream here, and I'll touch on a little bit more how it's connected into our red blood cells and hemoglobin, passes through these tiny blood vessels to get into our cells, and then how it has to leave our cells again, passing this kind of watery interstitial fluid, it's called, back into our bloodstream to go back to our lungs. Alright, so it's also a great idea, just like our digestive tract, to kind of know the structures that air passes by as it gets to the smallest parts of our lungs. So we're going to be in the nasal cavity to start, or in the oral cavity. We can breathe through our mouths as well. Then we're going in through that pharynx again. So the pharynx is where food and air will both pass by. It's like that crossroad before it gets to the two different tubes. So the tube going to our stomach is the esophagus. The tube going to our lungs is going to be our trachea. But first air passes by the larynx. So nasal cavity, pharynx, and larynx for air. And that is where our vocal cords are located. So it's going through our larynx, down our windpipe, also known as our trachea, into our right and left lungs. So now we start to branch off. So tubes are, the trachea then branches off into our bronchus, which are these largest pieces of the tubes, and then down into bronchioles, which are these smaller pieces of the tubes, and then they end in, so the bronchioles end in these alveoli. So alveoli is where all the important work happens. These are these kind of grape-like clusters are where oxygen and carbon dioxide actually passes out of our lung into our blood system. So these guys do, it's where the magic happens, I guess you would say. And it's also the structure that can become permanently damaged when you're a smoker. So these, we get actually damages these inner walls, so we have less surface area, so our bodies don't get enough or don't get as much oxygen, and they're not able to get rid of carbon dioxide as well. So tracing the route from the mouth to the lungs, so you can pause this to see if you're able to do it. But we're going to have P for pharynx, L for larynx, which is the vocal cords, T for trachea, which is the tube. Then we have our bronchus or bronchi that then branch into our bronchioles that end in our alveoli. Okay, so negative pressure breathing. So this is how our lungs work. So essentially, our rib cage, our muscles around our ribs contract, which expands our rib cage. Our diaphragm contracts and moves down. So it actually creates this negative pressure inside our chest cavity, which actually sucks air in. So again, our rib muscles and our diaphragm are contracting, which increases the size of our chest cavity, which actually creates a vacuum almost, which will suck air in to fill our lungs. And then as we exhale, our diaphragm and our rib muscles are relaxing, so our diaphragm is moving back up, which is allowing air to be exhaled. So our brain controls this, and it's also, so when we're exercising, or if we've held our breath, the reason our brain triggers us to breathe again or to increase our respiratory rate is the CO2 levels in our blood begin to rise, and our brain detects that and says, okay, we need to start breathing a little harder here in order to get rid of some of this carbon dioxide. So some people may think that we're breathing harder because we need more oxygen, but our brain is actually detecting too much carbon dioxide. So that's why we start to breathe a little heavier or more often during exercise. So the role of hemoglobin. So we'll talk a little bit more about red blood cells when we get into our circulatory system, but red blood cells actually contain millions of molecules of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is what oxygen will bind to. So in those tiny grape-like structures, the alveoli, when oxygen passes out of them into our bloodstream, they're actually adhering to these hemoglobin molecules that are on our red blood cells. And I think there's a good picture here. So that's a fairly large artery that it's showing here with blood inside and all of these little red blood cells. And every one of those red blood cells has millions of these hemoglobin molecules that will carry around our oxygen for us and carry out our carbon dioxide. And if you've ever heard of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is different from carbon dioxide, so it's something given off like when fuel is combusted. So an example would be generators can give off, or car exhaust can give off carbon monoxide, and it's actually, it does a better job of adhering to our hemoglobin than oxygen does. So that's why people can die from carbon monoxide poisoning, because our oxygen is no longer connecting to our hemoglobin. Okay, so smoking. There's a bit of a section in your book on smoking and how it damages lungs. So these stats are American, which is unfortunate, a little bit unfortunate, but you're going to see similar statistics in Canada as well. So it is true also in Canada that smoking will kill half of all people who smoke. So in the States, for example, that's about, almost 500,000 people every year. So 90% of all lung cancer is caused by smoking or exposure to smoke from cigarettes. It's causing more deaths than the combined total of accidents, alcohol, HIV, and murders. So that could be a question on a test, for example. This is showing like a diseased lung post-mortem from somebody who is a smoker compared to the pink healthy lungs of a non-smoker. This is some of the chemicals involved with cigarettes. Let's see here. And I just want to mention, so I'd mentioned that the alveoli, those important working structures in lungs, it's what can be permanently damaged from smoking, but smoking also paralyzes these little cilia or villi that are in our lung surface, so that things like mucus and toxins like tar can start to build up inside our lungs, so people can develop a cough and other disease related to that. So the cough is just it's our body's way of trying to get rid of those toxins that are in our lungs. So there are lots of not nice things that can happen by smoking. And a cool little thing in your book, it talks about people that are native to Tibet and live at high altitudes. And actually, athletes will go to train sometimes in higher altitudes because if your body can actually, or it's actually being exposed to 40% less oxygen than you are at sea level. So it is harder for your body to get oxygen at that high level. But there's been, as far as evolution is concerned, these folks have developed genes that make it easier for their body to take up lower levels of oxygen, and it may have to do with actually increasing the amount of hemoglobin or red blood cells that they have so that they're actually grabbing more that's available. That's a picture of being at high altitude. So coming up, I know this says Friday, I actually fixed it in our Skype session, but it's actually our discussion and our Mastering Biology assignments are due Sunday, so don't panic, they're due Sunday. And there's no reflection for this unit, and then we'll have our Unit 2 test, which is on or before February 8th. So post any questions about that. And and any other questions you may have as well. And then I will also post some review questions for that test in regards to digestion and respiration. Okay, thank you.